The briefing room at Bagram Airfield smelled like stale coffee and diesel exhaust, thick enough to coat the back of your throat. Major Dylan Reeves stood at the podium with his arms crossed, jaw set like carved stone, staring at the newest pilot in his squadron with the kind of contempt usually reserved for enemy combatants. Captain Nora Cale sat in the back row, spine straight, hands folded on the table in front of her, saying nothing. She'd learned years ago that silence was armor. The other pilots shifted in their seats, stealing glances at her, then at Reeves, waiting for the explosion everyone knew was coming. Reeves clicked to the next slide without looking at it. His voice came out flat, each word measured. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that command sent us a washed-up warthog driver who hasn't flown combat in 4 years to fill a slot we've been bleeding for since March." Nora didn't flinch. She kept her eyes on the projection screen where a map of Helmand Province glowed in tactical overlays. Someone coughed. Reeves took a step forward. "I asked you a question, Captain." She met his gaze then, her gray eyes steady and cold. "I didn't hear a question, sir. I heard a statement." The room went silent. Captain Marcus Voss, the squadron's XO, leaned back in his chair and let out a low whistle under his breath. Reeves' face darkened. He moved closer, standing directly in front of her now, close enough that she could smell the anger rolling off him like heat from tarmac. "Who put you here?" His voice dropped to something dangerous. "What political favor got you reassigned to my squadron when there are 50 combat-ready pilots rotting stateside?" Nora's throat tightened, but her expression didn't change. She knew what he saw when he looked at her. A woman in her mid-30s with a medical discharge on her record and a call sign nobody used anymore. A liability. A quota fill. A mistake. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was what had happened over Kandahar in 2019. The day her A-10 took hits that should have turned the aircraft into a fireball. The day she flew 90 miles on one engine and hydraulics held together by willpower and duct tape. The day 6 Marines walked off that hillside alive because she refused to leave until every last one of them was extracted. Her call sign had been Anvil, not because she was heavy, because she was unbreakable. Reeves leaned in closer, his breath hot against her face. "I'm going to make this very simple for you, Captain. This squadron operates at a level you can't even comprehend anymore. We don't carry dead weight. We don't babysit has-beens. And we sure as hell don't let political appointees get my men killed because command decided to play diversity bingo." Nora's hands tightened imperceptibly on the edge of the table. Every instinct told her to stand, to meet him at his level, to remind him that rank meant something even when respect didn't. But she'd played this game before. In rooms like this with men like him, the only winning move was to refuse to play. "Understood, sir," she said quietly. Reeves straightened, his lip curling. "You'll fly the milk runs, training sorties, logistics escort, nothing tactical, nothing that matters. You'll stay out of the way, collect your pay, and maybe, if you're lucky, you'll make it home without getting anyone killed." He turned to address the room. "The rest of you, mission briefing at 0500. We've got credible intel on a high-value target moving through the Arghandab Valley. Close air support package, danger close, hostile environment. Real pilot work." The dismissal was clear. Nora stood as the other pilots filed out, their eyes sliding past her like she was already a ghost. Only Voss paused at the door, glancing back with something that might have been sympathy or might have been pity. She couldn't tell anymore. Outside, the Afghan sun hammered down on the flight line, turning the rows of F-16s and Super Hornets into shimmering mirages. Nora walked past them toward the far end of the tarmac, where a single A-10 Thunderbolt II sat like a forgotten relic, tail number 739er, her aircraft. She ran her hand along the titanium bathtub that protected the cockpit, feeling the rivets and patch welds from a dozen combat repairs. The Warthog was ugly, slow, outdated by every modern metric. But it was built for one thing, keeping people alive when everything else failed, just like her. That night Nora sat alone in her quarters, a Quonset hut she shared with 2 intelligence analysts who were currently deployed forward. The walls were bare except for a single photograph tacked above her bunk. 6 Marines in desert fatigues, faces streaked with dust and blood, standing in front of a shot-up, with smoke still rising from the engine cowling. In the center, a younger version of herself, helmet under one arm, the faintest trace of a smile on her face. Sergeant First Class Miguel Herrera had taken that photo. He'd been the team leader that day, the one who'd coordinated the extraction under fire while she made gun runs so close to their position that the spent brass from her GAU-8 had rained down on their helmets. He'd written her a letter 6 months after she'd been medically discharged. She still carried it in her flight suit pocket, the paper soft from being folded and unfolded too many times. It said 3 things. Thank you. You saved my life. Don't let them tell you it didn't matter. She pulled the letter out now, reading it in the dim light, then carefully folded it back along the worn creases. Outside, the sound of fighter jets taking off split the night, their afterburners painting the sky orange. Nora closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. She knew what tomorrow would bring. More contempt, more dismissal, more reminders that she didn't belong, but she also knew something else. She knew how to fly when the hydraulics were gone and the engine was on fire. She knew how to stay in the fight when every system was screaming at her to eject. And she knew that the men who'd stood in front of that A-10 4 years ago hadn't cared about politics or quotas or diversity bingo. They'd cared about one thing. She'd come when they called, and she'd stayed until the job was done. The alarm went off at 04:30. Nora was already awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors in the distance. She dressed in the dark, pulling on her flight suit with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times. The name tape over her right breast pocket read KAEL in black letters. The squadron patch on her shoulder showed a red hawk with talons extended. She'd sewn it on herself the night before, using a needle and thread from her personal kit, because nobody from the squadron had offered to do it for her. The ready room was empty when she arrived at 0500. She poured herself a cup of coffee from the industrial-sized percolator, the liquid thick and bitter enough to strip paint. The mission board on the wall showed the day's flight schedule in neat columns. Training sortie, logistics run, base patrol, all assigned to tail 739er. All assigned to Kale. She was studying the weather report when the door banged open and the rest of the squadron flooded in, loud and wired on pre-mission adrenaline. They moved around her like water around a stone, filling the room but leaving a careful buffer of empty space in every direction. Reeves entered last, his flight suit crisp, his helmet bag slung over one shoulder. He glanced at Nora once, a look of cold assessment, then turned to the mission brief without acknowledging her presence. "All right, listen up," he said, his voice cutting through the chatter. "Operation Righteous Hammer is a go. We've got eyes on a high-value individual believed to be coordinating Taliban operations out of a compound in the Arghandab Valley. Ground element is moving into position now. Our job is to provide close air support if things go sideways." He clicked through satellite imagery showing a cluster of mud brick buildings surrounded by poppy fields and irrigation ditches. Rules of engagement are weapons tight. We don't fire unless the ground commander clears it. This is a surgical strike in a populated area. No room for error. Voss raised his hand. "What's the air threat assessment?" "Minimal," Reeves replied. "No fixed-wing opposition. Possible MA and PADS, but intelligence says the area's been quiet for 3 weeks. We'll have an EA-18G Growler on station for electronic warfare support if we need it." He turned to the pilots. "Call signs are Hammer 1 through Hammer 4. I'm lead. Voss, you're 2. De Graw, you're 3. Ortiz, you're 4. We're wheels up in 30 minutes. Nora took a sip of her coffee, tasting ash and disappointment. Not even a backup, not even a spare. Reeves caught her looking and smiled, the expression sharp and humorless. "Something you want to say, Captain?" She set her coffee down carefully. "No, sir." "Good, because while we're doing real work, you'll be flying a lazy circle over Kandahar airfield making sure the cargo haulers don't run into each other. Try not to screw that up." Laughter rippled through the room, low and mean. Nora felt it like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders, but she kept her face neutral, her eyes steady. She'd learned a long time ago that showing pain only made them push harder. Reeves dismissed the brief, and the pilots filed out toward the flight line, their boots ringing on the metal flooring. Nora waited until the room was empty before standing, finishing her coffee in one long swallow and heading out into the pre-dawn darkness. Tail 739er sat exactly where she'd left it, hunched and predatory, its nose art faded from years of sun exposure. Someone had painted a cartoon anvil on the fuselage once back when her call sign still meant something. Now it was just a ghost outline, barely visible under layers of desert camouflage paint. She did her pre-flight in silence, checking control surfaces, hydraulic lines, ammunition feeds. The GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon mounted in the nose was loaded with 30mm high-explosive incendiary rounds, 1,100 of them, enough to turn an armored vehicle into scrap metal in seconds. The wings carried Maverick missiles and Hydra rocket pods, all of it designed for one purpose: ground attack, close air support, keeping the people below alive. By the time she climbed into the cockpit, the sun was just starting to edge over the mountains to the east, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood. Nora strapped in, the 5-point harness clicking into place with familiar precision. She ran through her startup checklist by memory, listening to the twin turbofan engine spool up with a low, rumbling growl. The A-10 didn't purr. It snarled. She checked in with Tower, her voice calm and professional over the radio. Bagram Tower, Anvil 39er, request taxi clearance for training sortie. There was a pause, then a bored voice replied. Anvil 39er cleared to taxi runway 23, winds 210 at 8 knots, altimeter 3012. Cleared to taxi runway 23, Anvil 39er. She released the brakes and the Warthog rolled forward, slow and deliberate, its landing gear groaning under 12 tons of aircraft and ordnance. On the parallel taxiway, she watched the 4 F-16s of Hammer Flight take off in sequence, their afterburners igniting in brilliant cones of white-hot flame as they punched into the morning sky. They climbed fast and steep, disappearing into the haze within seconds, off to do the real work while she flew in circles like a glorified traffic cop. Nora didn't let herself feel it. The resentment, the anger, the bone-deep exhaustion of proving herself over and over again only to be told it still wasn't enough. She focused on the instrument panel in front of her, the familiar dials and gauges that made sense when nothing else did. Bagram Tower, Anvil 39er, ready for departure. Anvil 39er, cleared for takeoff runway 23. Fly safe out there, Captain. She didn't respond to the last part. Just pushed the throttles forward and felt the A-10 accelerate down the runway, heavy and solid, the nose lifting reluctantly as she reached rotation speed. The aircraft climbed like it resented every foot of altitude, but once airborne, it settled into a steady, brutal efficiency that Nora had always found comforting. This was where she belonged, not in briefing rooms, not defending herself against men who'd already decided she was worthless. Here, in the sky, where the only thing that mattered was whether you could do the job when everything else fell apart. She leveled off at 15,000 feet and established a holding pattern over Kandahar airfield, watching the sprawl of military infrastructure below, the endless rows of tents and bunkers and blast walls that marked the American presence in this ancient, unforgiving country. Her radio crackled with routine chatter, transport pilots calling out positions, helicopter traffic coordinating with the tower, the mundane symphony of a military base going about its daily business. Nora half listened, her eyes scanning the horizon out of habit more than necessity. The sky was clear. The threat board showed green across all sectors. Nothing to worry about. Nothing to do but fly in circles and burn fuel until her scheduled return time. She thought about Miguel Herrera and the 5 other Marines in that photograph, wondered where they were now, if they still thought about that day. If they knew she'd been benched, sidelined, turned into a cautionary tale about what happens when you take damage and refuse to quit. The radio suddenly came alive with a different voice, sharp and urgent, cutting through the routine traffic like a knife. Any station this net, this is Hammer 11 actual, troops in contact, requesting immediate close air support, grid November Victor 728-436, how copy? Nora's hand moved to her transmit button before her conscious mind caught up. That was the ground commander for Operation Righteous Hammer, The mission Reeves and his flight were supposed to be supporting, but the voice on the radio wasn't calling for Hammer flight. It was calling for anyone, which meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. She switched to the tactical frequency, her pulse starting to climb. Hammer 1, Anvil 39er, say status, static. Then Reeves' voice, clipped and tense. Anvil, stay off this frequency. We're handling it. Hammer 1, Anvil copies, standing by. But she didn't switch back to the Kandahar Tower frequency. She stayed exactly where she was, listening to the chaos unfold 30 miles to the west. The radio traffic was fragmentary, overlapping calls from multiple sources painting a picture Nora had seen too many times before. The ground element had encountered heavy resistance. The Taliban fighters weren't running. They were dug in, coordinated, waiting. Hammer flight was engaged, making gun runs with precision-guided munitions, but the enemy had spread out into the poppy fields and irrigation ditches, using the terrain to mask their positions. And now, according to the increasingly desperate calls from the ground commander, the American troops were pinned down with casualties mounting and no clear path to extraction. Hammer 1, Hammer 1-1 actual, we need danger close support on the tree line, 100 meters north of my position, enemy in prepared fighting positions, we have wounded who can't move. Reeves' voice came back taut with stress. Hammer 1-1, Hammer 1, negative on danger close. Too much deflection, can't guarantee accuracy at that distance. Recommend you pull back to the rally point. Negative Hammer 1, we've got 2 urgent surgical and 3 priority. We cannot move without cover. Request you put steel on that tree line now. There was a pause. Nora could hear the calculations happening in Reeves' head. The risk assessment, the rules of engagement, the knowledge that one mistake could kill the very people he was trying to save. When he spoke again, his voice was strained. Hammer 1-1, Hammer 1, we're Winchester on precision monuments, switching to guns, making my approach from the south. Nora knew what that meant. The F-16's M61 Vulcan cannon, 20mm rounds, accurate but not designed for close air support in tight quarters. The Viper was a fighter, built for speed and maneuverability, not for grinding, low-altitude work over troops in contact. She listened as Hammer flight made their runs, the ground commander calling corrections, the sound of automatic weapons fire bleeding through the radio transmissions. Then Reeves' voice, sharp with frustration. Hammer 1-1, Hammer 1, no joy, no joy. I can't see them in the vegetation. Risk of friendly fire is too high. The ground commander's response was ragged, barely controlled. Hammer 1, we are taking effective fire from multiple positions. We need suppression now or we're not getting out of here. Nora's hands tightened on the stick. She looked down at her fuel gauge, ran the math in her head. 30 miles, 6 minutes at cruise speed. She could be over the target area before the situation deteriorated further, but Reeves had ordered her to stay off the frequency, to stay out of the way, to let the real pilots handle it. She switched her radio back to Bagram Tower. Bagram Tower, Anvil 39er, requesting permission to divert to support troops in contact, grid November Victor 728436. The tower controller's voice was uncertain. Anvil 39er, stand by. The seconds stretched out. Nora watched her navigation display, the distance to the target area flickering in digital readout. Every second was another round fired, another Marine pinned down. Another chance for someone to bleed out in a poppy field because the cavalry couldn't get close enough. Anvil 39er, Bagram Tower, you're not assigned to that mission package. Recommend you remain on station. Nora took a slow breath. She thought about the photograph above her bunk, about Miguel Herrera's letter, about the promise she'd made to herself the day she'd climbed back into a cockpit after the medical board had tried to ground her permanently. She switched back to the tactical frequency. Hammer 1, Anvil 39er, inbound from the east, ETA 6 mics. I can take the danger close work if you need it. The silence on the radio was deafening. Then Reeves' voice, cold and furious. Anvil 39er, I ordered you to stay off this net. You are not authorized for this mission. Break off and return to base immediately. The ground commander cut in before Nora could respond. Hammer 1, Hammer 1-1 actual, if she can put accurate fire on that tree line. I don't care what her authorization status is. We need help now. Nora didn't wait for Reeves to reply. She banked the A-10 hard to the west, pushing the throttles forward, feeling the aircraft respond with its characteristic stubbornness, accelerating slowly but building momentum with every second. The distance to target began counting down on her display. 5 miles, 4 miles, 3 miles. She descended to 5,000 feet, low enough to get eyes on the battlefield, high enough to stay out of effective range of small arms fire. The Arghandab Valley opened up below her, a patchwork of green fields and brown earth cut through with irrigation channels. She could see smoke rising from multiple points, the gray-black columns marking where ordnance had already been dropped. Her targeting pod came online, the infrared camera giving her a monochrome view of the terrain below. She spotted the F-16s orbiting at 12,000 feet, high and fast, making occasional passes, but unable to commit to sustained fire. Then she saw the ground element, a cluster of heat signatures huddled behind a low berm, surrounded on 3 sides by muzzle flashes and movement in the vegetation. They were in a kill zone, exactly where you never wanted to be, and the enemy was closing in. Hammer 1-1 actual, Anvil 3-9er. I have you visual, I'm 3 miles out, talk to me. The ground commander's voice was tight but focused. Anvil 3-9er, targets are in the tree line marked by smoke, 100 meters north of my position. Enemy infantry with crew-served weapons. We need immediate suppression. Copy, talk in 100 meters, tree line with smoke. Confirm friendlies are south of that line. Affirm, friendlies are south. All indigenous forces are accounted for. Anything north of the berm is hostile. Nora's fingers moved across her weapons panel, selecting the GAU-8. 1,100 rounds of 30mm Fury, each one the size of a milk bottle, designed to kill tanks. Against infantry in the open, it was a scythe. She rolled into her attack run, dropping to 2,000 feet, the A-10's nose pointing at the ground like an accusing finger. The targeting reticle settled over the tree line, steady despite the turbulence. She could see movement now, figures in the vegetation, the telltale flash of rifles firing. Hammer 1-1, Anvil 3-9er is in hot, 30 Mike, danger close, keep your heads down. She squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 roared to life with a sound like the world tearing itself apart, a deep, resonating brrrrrrrt that shook the entire airframe. The cannon fired at 65 rounds per second, each projectile leaving the barrel at 3,400 feet per second, crossing the distance to the target in less than a heartbeat. Nora watched through her targeting pod as the tree line disintegrated. Entire trees exploded into splinters. The earth erupted in geysers of dirt and debris. The enemy position simply ceased to exist, replaced by a curtain of destruction 50 meters wide and 10 meters deep. She pulled off the target, climbing back to 3,000 feet, scanning for secondary threats. Hammer 1-1, Anvil 3-9er is off target, assess. There was a beat of stunned silence. Then the ground commander's voice, hushed with something like awe. Anvil 3-9er, good hits, enemy fire has ceased, you just saved our lives, how copy? Solid copy, Hammer 1-1. I'm still holding ordnance, standing by for further tasking. She heard Reeves on the radio then, his voice hard. Anvil 3-9er, Hammer 1, you are ordered to egress the area immediately and return to base. You directly violated my instructions and you will answer for it. Nora's jaw tightened. She was about to respond when the ground commander cut in again, his voice sharp. Hammer 1-1, belay that order. We are still in a hostile situation and I need that A-10 on station. Anvil 3-9er, stay with us. Reeves clearly wanted to argue, but the ground commander outranked him. After a long pause, Hammer Flight Lead responded with barely contained fury. Roger, Hammer 1-1. Anvil, you stay on this frequency and you follow my instructions to the letter. One more unauthorized action and I'll have you court-martialed. Copy, Hammer 1. Nora kept her voice neutral, professional, giving him nothing to use against her later, but inside her heart was pounding, not from fear, from the pure, crystalline clarity of doing exactly what she was built to do. For the next 40 minutes, Nora orbited over the battlefield like a guardian angel carved from titanium and rage. The ground element called for suppression on enemy reinforcements moving through the poppy fields. She made 3 more gun runs, each one surgical and precise, the GAU-8 turning enemy fighters into memory before they could reach the American position. When a Taliban technical truck appeared on a dirt road 2 kilometers north, mounting a heavy machine gun, she put a Maverick missile through the engine block from 4 miles out. The truck vaporized, leaving nothing but a black scorch mark and scattered metal. When enemy mortars started dropping near the casualty collection point, she identified the firing position using her targeting pod and marked it with white phosphorus rockets, giving Hammer Flight a clean target for their remaining ordnance. Reeves' F-16s came in high and fast, dropping JDAMs that silenced the mortars permanently. Through it all, she stayed low and slow, grinding away at the enemy with the kind of sustained presence that fast movers couldn't match. The A-10 wasn't elegant, it wasn't sexy, but it did one thing better than any other aircraft in the inventory. It stayed. Eventually, the medevac helicopters arrived, their rotors thumping heavy in the late morning heat. The ground element loaded their wounded and began their extraction, covered by Nora's circling presence overhead. She watched through her pod as they moved out in 2 columns, the line of vehicles snaking through the valley floor toward the relative safety of the rally point. Only when the last Humvee had cleared the danger area did the ground commander come back on the radio. Anvil 39er, Hammer 11 actual, we are clear of the objective area and proceeding to extract. I want you to know that your actions today were nothing short of extraordinary. You came when we needed you and you executed perfectly under pressure. Those Marines owe you their lives. Nora's throat tightened. She recognized the tone in his voice. The same one Miguel Herrera had used 4 years ago, standing beside that shot-up A-10, trying to find words big enough for what she'd done. Just doing my job, Hammer 11. Glad everyone's going home. Anvil, I'm putting you in for a decoration. What you did today deserves recognition. Before Nora could respond, Reeves' voice cut across the frequency, brittle with barely suppressed rage. Hammer 11, Hammer 1, we're Winchester and RTB. Anvil, you follow us back to Bagram and report directly to my office. Is that clear? Crystal, Hammer 1. The flight back was silent, the 4 F-16s of Hammer Flight streaking ahead at 500 knots while Nora plodded along behind at 300, nursing her fuel and trying not to think about what was waiting for her on the ground. She knew what was coming. Reeves would write her up for insubordination, for violating orders, for putting the mission at risk with her cowboy antics. It didn't matter that she'd saved lives. It didn't matter that the ground commander had explicitly requested her presence. What mattered was that she'd made him look bad, that she'd proven in front of everyone that his precise, by-the-book approach wasn't always the right answer, that sometimes you needed someone willing to get low and dirty and grind it out meter by meter until the job was done. She touched down at Bagram just after noon, the A-10's wheels kissing the runway with a jarring thump that rattled her teeth. She taxied back to the hardstand, shut down the engines, and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, listening to the airframe tick and cool around her. When she finally climbed down, Reeves was waiting. He stood 20 feet from the aircraft, his flight suit unzipped at the collar, his face flushed red from anger or heat or both. The rest of Hammer Flight stood behind him in a loose semicircle, watching with expressions that ranged from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Voss the XO stood slightly apart, his arms crossed, his face carefully neutral. Nora walked toward them, her helmet bag slung over one shoulder, her body language deliberately calm. Don't give them anything, she thought. Don't react. Don't defend. Just let him burn himself out. Reeves didn't wait for her to speak. My office, now. The squadron commander's office was a converted shipping container with a desk, 2 chairs, and a wall of filing cabinets that looked like they'd survived multiple deployments. Reeves slammed the door hard enough to make the metal walls ring. He didn't offer her a seat, just stood behind his desk with his hands braced on the surface, leaning forward like he was trying to physically intimidate her through sheer proximity. What you did today, he said slowly, his voice dangerously quiet, was the most reckless, insubordinate display I have ever witnessed in 20 years of military service. You directly violated my orders. You inserted yourself into a mission you were not assigned to. You endangered the lives of everyone on that battlefield with your grandstanding. Nora stood at attention, her eyes fixed on a point on the wall behind his head. Sir, with respect, the ground commander requested close air support from any available aircraft. I was available. I provided that support. Don't you dare try to justify this with technicalities. Reeves' voice rose to a shout. I told you to stay off that frequency. I told you to stay out of the way. You deliberately disobeyed a direct order because you wanted to prove something, because you couldn't accept that you're not good enough for this squadron anymore. The words hit like body blows, but Nora kept her face blank. She'd heard variations of this speech 100 times, from the medical board that wanted to ground her, from the training command that didn't want to recertify her, from every superior officer who looked at her record and saw a liability instead of a pilot. Reeves wasn't done. He came around the desk, moving into her personal space, his face inches from hers. You want to know why you're here? You want to know why command sent you to my squadron? His voice dropped to a venomous whisper. Because nobody else would take you. Because you're damaged goods. Because every other squadron commander in theater took one look at your file and said, no thanks, we don't need the headache. He jabbed a finger at her chest, not quite making contact but close enough that she could feel the air move. You think what you did today makes you a hero. You think one lucky gun run erases 4 years of being a washout. You're wrong. You're a danger to yourself and everyone around you, and I'm going to make sure command knows exactly what kind of pilot they saddled me with. Nora felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest. She'd stood in front of men like this before, men who needed her to break, who needed her to cry or shout or give them an excuse to dismiss her completely. She'd learned the hard way that the only winning move was to refuse them that satisfaction. When she spoke, her voice was calm and level, each word measured. Sir, I followed the ground commander's direction. I engaged targets using appropriate weapons and tactics. The mission was successful with 0 friendly casualties. If you want to write me up for insubordination, that's your right. But the Marines on that hillside are alive because I did my job. Reeves stared at her, his jaw working like he was chewing through something bitter. For a moment she thought he might actually strike her. Then he turned away, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Get out of my office, he said quietly. You're grounded pending investigation. I'm recommending to command that you be reassigned to a non-flying billet effective immediately. You'll turn in your flight authorization and secure your gear. Dismissed. Nora saluted, even though his back was turned, and left. Outside the container, the rest of Hammer Flight had dispersed, but Voss was still there, leaning against a concrete barrier, smoking a cigarette. He watched her approach with an unreadable expression. That looked rough, he said. Nora didn't break stride. It's fine. Hey, Voss pushed off the barrier, falling into step beside her. For what it's worth, what you did today was solid. Reeves knows it too, that's why he's so pissed. She glanced at him, surprised. Voss shrugged. Those Marines are alive because you got low and did the hard work. The rest of us were up there playing it safe, worried about our next OER. You just flew. He took a drag off his cigarette, exhaled slowly. Doesn't mean Reeves won't bury you for it, but you should know that some of us saw what happened out there. Nora nodded once, not trusting herself to speak, and kept walking toward her quarters. That night, alone in the Quonset hut, she sat on her bunk and stared at the photograph of the 6 Marines. Miguel Herrera's face looked back at her, young and dusty and alive because she'd refused to quit when the smart move would have been to eject and let someone else handle the problem. She wondered if he'd heard about today. If somewhere, in some other base or barracks or forward operating position, he'd gotten word that the pilot who saved his life 4 years ago had just done it again for someone else. She wondered if it mattered. Her flight authorization sat on the small desk beside her bunk, a laminated card that represented everything she'd fought to regain after the medical discharge. Tomorrow, she'd have to turn it in. Tomorrow, Reeves would start the paperwork to have her removed from flight status permanently. Tomorrow she'd be nothing but a cautionary tale, a pilot who couldn't follow orders, a woman who should have known her place. But tonight she had the photograph, and the letter in her pocket, and the knowledge that somewhere in Afghanistan, 7 people who would have died today were still breathing because she'd made a choice to show up when it mattered. She folded the letter back along its worn creases, tucked it into her flight suit, and lay back on the bunk, staring at the curved metal ceiling of the hut. Outside, the sound of fighter jets taking off split the darkness, their engines howling into the night sky. Nora closed her eyes and listened to the sound fade into distance, knowing it might be the last time she heard it from the inside. But even grounded, even buried in paperwork and administrative purgatory, she'd still be the pilot who stayed when everyone else left. She'd still be Anvil. And that, at least, was something they couldn't take away. The investigation took 3 days. Nora spent them in administrative limbo, confined to base, her flight authorization suspended, her aircraft secured and off-limits. She wasn't allowed in the ready room, wasn't allowed to attend briefings, wasn't allowed to do anything but sit in her quarters and wait while Reeves built his case against her. On the second day, she was summoned to give a formal statement to the operations officer, a lieutenant colonel named Brennan who listened to her account with a poker face that revealed nothing. He asked precise questions about the radio communications, about her decision-making process, about whether she'd understood Reeves' order to stay off the frequency. Nora answered everything truthfully, without embellishment or excuse. Yes, she'd heard the order. Yes, she'd understood it. Yes, she'd violated it anyway because troops were in contact, and no one else could provide the close air support they needed. Brennan wrote everything down in careful longhand, his pen scratching across the yellow legal pad in front of him. When he was finished, he set the pen down and looked at her for a long moment. "Captain Cale," he said slowly, "you understand that insubordination in a combat zone is a serious offense. Major Reeves has recommended you be removed from flight status and reassigned to a desk job stateside. He's also considering whether to pursue disciplinary action under the UCMJ." Nora kept her face neutral. "Yes, sir. He's also received a formal letter of commendation from Captain First Class Sullivan, the ground commander you supported. Sullivan is recommending you for a Distinguished Flying Cross for your actions. He's called your performance, quote, the finest example of close air support under fire I've witnessed in 15 years of combat operations," end quote. Brennan tapped the pen against the legal pad. "So we have a situation where you're simultaneously being recommended for one of the highest decorations we can award and for court-martial. You see the problem here?" "Yes, sir." "What I need to understand, Captain, is why you made the choice you did, not the tactical justification. I've read the after-action reports. I know you executed the mission flawlessly. What I need to understand is whether you're someone who can follow orders in a military hierarchy, or whether you're going to freelance every time you think you know better than your commanding officer." Nora chose her words carefully. "Sir, I believe in chain of command. I've spent 18 years in this uniform following orders, most of them from people who knew more than I did. But I also believe that there are moments when the right thing and the legal thing aren't the same. When Marines are dying on the ground and I have the capability to save them, I can't stay out of the fight just because someone told me to stay in my lane." Brennan studied her. "Even if it means your career. Even then, sir." He nodded slowly, then closed the legal pad and stood. "Thank you for your candor, Captain. I'll submit my findings to the chain of command. You'll be notified of the outcome." That was 2 days ago. Now it was late afternoon on the third day, and Nora sat on the steps outside her quarters, watching the sun slide toward the mountains, wondering if this was what the end of her flying career looked like. Not a dramatic crash or a medical emergency, just administrative paperwork and a desk job processing logistics reports until she hit 20 years and could retire with a pension. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear the footsteps approaching until a shadow fell across the steps. She looked up to find Voss standing there, his hands shoved in his pockets, an uncertain expression on his face. "Got a minute?" he asked. Nora shrugged. "I've got nothing but minutes." Voss sat down beside her, leaving a respectful space between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "The squadron's talking." "I bet they are. Some of them think you're crazy. think you threw away your career for a moment of glory. He paused. Some of them think you're the only honest pilot in the unit. Nora glanced at him. What do you think? Voss was quiet for a moment, watching a helicopter lift off from the pad across the airfield. I think I've been flying combat missions for 6 years, and I've never once had to make the kind of choice you made. I've never been in a situation where doing the right thing meant disobeying a direct order from my commander, and I'm not sure what I would have done if I had been. He turned to look at her directly. But I do know that those Marines wouldn't have made it out without you. Reeves was playing it safe. I was playing it safe. We had the altitude and the speed and the standoff weapons, and we convinced ourselves that was enough. You knew it wasn't, and you did something about it. Reeves is going to crucify me for it. Maybe, but there's something you should know. Voss reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This showed up on the squadron bulletin board this morning. Someone printed it out from a secure email. He handed it to Nora. She unfolded it and read. It was a message from Captain Sullivan, the ground commander, sent to the wing commander and copied to half the command structure in theater. It was 3 paragraphs long, and every sentence was a laser-focused defense of Nora's actions. Sullivan described in precise detail how his unit had been pinned down under effective fire, how Hammer Flight had been unable to provide the danger-close support they needed, and how Captain Cale had arrived unbidden and executed 6 separate gun runs, with such precision that not a single Marine had been injured by friendly fire despite working at distances the field manual explicitly said were too dangerous. The final paragraph read, Captain Cale's actions exemplify everything we ask of our combat aviators: courage, skill, and an unwavering commitment to protecting ground forces under fire. Any attempt to discipline her for providing life-saving support to troops in contact would send a chilling message to every pilot in theater that following orders is more important than saving lives. I respectfully but urgently request that her actions be recognized for what they were. Exactly what we needed, exactly when we needed it. Nora read it twice, then carefully refolded the paper and handed it back to Voss. She didn't trust herself to speak. It gets better, Voss said quietly. Sullivan also reached out to every Marine he pulled off that hillside. They're all writing statements. Every single one of them is going on record to say you saved their lives. He stood, brushing dust off his flight suit. Reeves can still push for discipline if he wants. But he's going to have to do it in front of a command structure that's reading testimonials from a dozen combat veterans who think you walk on water. That's a fight even he might not want to pick. Nora finally found her voice. Why are you telling me this? Voss smiled, the expression crooked and genuine. Because some of us remember what it's like to give a damn about the people on the ground. And because if Reeves does manage to get you kicked out of the cockpit, the squadron loses the one pilot who still understands what this job is actually about. He turned to leave, then paused. Also, for what it's worth, your call sign makes sense now. I looked it up in the old squadron records. Anvil, because you don't bend and you don't break, no matter what gets thrown at you. He walked away before Nora could respond, leaving her sitting on the steps with the setting sun in her eyes and something unfamiliar blooming in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it. Hope. The summons came the next morning, not to Reeves' office, but to the wing commander's headquarters, a climate-controlled building that smelled like carpet cleaner and military bureaucracy. Nora put on a fresh uniform, made sure her ribbons were straight, and walked across the base with her heart pounding in her chest. Whatever was about to happen, this was where it ended, one way or another. The wing commander was a colonel named Hartwell, a former F-15 pilot with gray hair and a reputation for being fair but uncompromising. He stood when Nora was shown into his office, gesturing to a chair across from his desk. "Sit down, Captain Cale." Nora sat, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Hartwell studied her for a moment, then picked up a file folder from his desk. "I've spent the last 3 days reading reports about you. Some of them are glowing. Some of them are scathing. Do you want to know which ones I believe?" "I'd rather just know where I stand, sir." Hartwell's mouth twitched in what might have been amusement. "Fair enough. Here's where you stand. Major Reeves has submitted a formal request that you be removed from flight status for insubordination and reckless endangerment. Captain Sullivan has submitted a recommendation that you be awarded a Distinguished Flying Cross. The operations officer believes you violated the chain of command but achieved mission success, and I've got a dozen Marines willing to testify under oath that you saved their lives. He set the folder down and leaned back in his chair. The easy thing would be to split the difference, give you a letter of reprimand for the insubordination but acknowledge your tactical success, send you back to flying with a slap on the wrist and hope everyone forgets about it. Nora waited, knowing there was more. But I didn't get to this rank by taking the easy path, so let me ask you a question, Captain. Do you think you were right to disobey Major Reeves' order? It was a trap. If she said yes, she was admitting to insubordination and validating everything Reeves had said about her. If she said no, she was lying and they both knew it. Nora looked Hartwell in the eye and made her choice. Yes, sir, I do. The silence stretched out. Then Hartwell nodded slowly. So do I. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the flight line where rows of aircraft baked in the afternoon sun. The problem with military hierarchy is that it requires people to obey orders even when those orders are wrong. Most of the time, that's necessary. Discipline and structure keep us effective. But there are moments, rare moments, when blind obedience becomes the enemy of mission success. When the person on the ground knows something the person giving orders doesn't. He turned to face her. You were on station. You had eyes on the battlefield. You knew what the ground commander needed, and you knew your aircraft could deliver it when the fast movers couldn't. Major Reeves was operating with incomplete information and making decisions based on doctrine rather than reality. In that moment, you made a judgment call that saved lives. Hartwell walked back to his desk and picked up another folder. I'm not going to remove you from flight status. I'm also not going to reprimand you. What I am going to do is issue a formal guidance memo to all squadron commanders in theater reminding them that close air support is a ground commander's asset, not a flight lead's asset. If troops in contact request support, any available aircraft will respond regardless of mission assignment. He handed the folder to Nora. It was her flight authorization, along with new orders assigning her as the primary A-10 pilot for all danger-close support missions in the region. You're going to be very busy, Captain, because every ground unit that heard what you did is going to request you specifically when things get bad. That's the burden you've earned. Nora took the folder, her hands shaking slightly. And Major Reeves, sir. Major Reeves is an excellent pilot and a competent commander who made a tactically sound decision based on the information he had. He's also a man who doesn't like being shown up, especially by someone he's already decided doesn't belong. I'll deal with him. You focus on flying. Hartwell extended his hand. Nora stood and shook it, feeling the calluses of a fellow pilot against her palm. Don't make me regret this, Captain. I won't, sir. The flight line felt different when Nora walked back to it that afternoon, the shadows long and the heat finally breaking as evening approached. Tail 739er sat where she'd left it, patient and ugly and perfect. Someone had washed the dust off the canopy. When she got closer, she saw why. Painted on the fuselage beside the faded outline of the old anvil was a new piece of nose art. A cartoon figure of a female pilot in full flight gear, standing on a mountain of broken enemy equipment, one hand on her hip, the other holding a massive hammer. Above it, in crisp white letters, Anvil, and below in smaller script, still unbreakable. Nora stood there for a long moment, her throat tight, her eyes stinging in the dust and wind. She didn't know who'd done it. Didn't know if it was Voss or one of the other pilots or some crew chief who'd heard the story and decided it needed to be told. It didn't matter. What mattered was that the call sign she'd earned 4 years ago in blood and hydraulic fluid was back where it belonged. On her aircraft. In the record. Acknowledged. She climbed into the cockpit and sat in the familiar seat, her hands resting on the controls, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle into something solid and real. Tomorrow, there would be another mission, another call for close air support, another chance to prove that staying in the fight was always worth it. But tonight, She just sat in the cockpit and watched the sun set over the Hindu Kush, the mountains turning purple and gold in the fading light. She thought about Miguel Herrera and the Marines she'd never met who'd written statements on her behalf. She thought about Captain Sullivan and his unwavering belief that what she'd done mattered. She thought about Voss and the other pilots who'd started to look at her differently, not as a liability but as someone who understood what this job really meant. And she thought about Major Reeves, bitter and angry, watching his carefully ordered world crack because someone had reminded him that rules existed to serve the mission, not the other way around. She didn't hate him, couldn't afford to. In a war zone, you flew with the people you had, not the people you wanted. But she also knew that she'd never again let someone like him convince her that following orders was more important than bringing people home alive. 3 weeks later, Nora was on her 14th combat mission since being reinstated. The pattern had become familiar. A call from a ground unit in contact, coordinates in a valley or on a hillside or in an urban warren where fast movers couldn't work. Her A-10 rolling in low and slow, the GAU-8 roaring, the enemy positions disintegrating under focused, surgical violence. She'd become the pilot every ground commander asked for by name. The one who showed up when things were desperate and stayed until the job was finished. The one who made gun runs at altitudes that made other pilots nervous and put ordnance within 50 meters of friendly forces without breaking a sweat. Hammer flights still flew their missions, still provided top cover and precision strikes from altitude. But when the shooting started and the distances got tight, everyone knew who to call. Anvil. Reeves had stopped speaking to her entirely. He issued orders through Voss, communicated only in writing, treated her like a piece of equipment rather than a pilot. Nora didn't care. She had her flight authorization. She had her aircraft. She had Marines and soldiers and Afghan commandos who went home to their families because she'd been there when it mattered. That was enough. But on this particular mission, everything changed. It started with a distress call from a Special Forces team working deep in Kandahar province, 40 miles from the nearest American base. They'd been compromised during a high-value target raid, their vehicles disabled by IEDs, enemy forces converging from multiple directions. The call came through on the emergency frequency, the team leader's voice calm but urgent, requesting immediate close air support and medevac. Nora was airborne within 5 minutes, pushing her A-10 as fast as it would go across the desert landscape. Behind her, Hammer flights scrambled, but they were 10 minutes back, delayed by a maintenance issue that had grounded 2 of their aircraft. For the critical first quarter hour, Nora would be alone over the target. The Special Forces team was dug in behind a low ridge, taking fire from 3 sides, one of their members critically wounded and bleeding out despite the team medic's best efforts. They'd already expended most of their ammunition holding off the initial assault. The enemy was pressing hard, sensing weakness. Nora arrived over the target at dusk, the sun painting the desert in shades of blood and copper. She could see the team's position from 5 miles out, a cluster of heat signatures and the telltale flash of weapons fire in the growing darkness. The enemy was everywhere. Dozens of fighters, maybe more, using terrain and approaching darkness to mask their movements. Anvil 39er, this is Viper 26, the team leader transmitted, his voice tight. We are critically low on ammunition and have one urgent surgical. Enemy is within 100 meters on 3 sides. We need immediate fire support or we're not making it out of here. Nora ran the tactical picture in her head. This wasn't a standard close air support mission. This was a desperate rescue against overwhelming odds in failing light with no backup and no margin for error. Everything she'd been trained for, everything she'd proven she could do, came down to the next 30 minutes. Viper 26, Anvil 39er, I'm overhead with full combat load, talk to me. The team leader called out target priorities. A group of fighters massing on the northern approach. A technical with a heavy machine gun setting up on the western ridge. Enemy reinforcements moving up through a wadi from the south. Nora marked them all on her display, calculating angles and safe distances, building her attack sequence in real time. She rolled in on the northern group first, the GAU-8 tearing through the twilight with its distinctive roar. The fighters scattered, some hit, others diving for cover. She pulled off, banked hard, and came back on the technical. A Maverick missile streaked from her wing, the warhead impacting dead center and erasing the vehicle in an orange fireball. The enemy reinforcements in the wadi were harder. They'd spread out, using the terrain to mask themselves, making individual targeting impossible. Nora descended to 1,000 feet, dangerously low, and made a strafing run the length of the wadi, her cannon chewing up the ground in a continuous burst that sent dirt and debris fountaining into the air. She didn't know how many she hit, didn't care. The goal was suppression, making the enemy keep their heads down long enough for the team to reposition. Anvil 39er, Viper 26, good effects. We're moving to the rally point, but they're still coming. Can you stay with us? Nora checked her fuel. She had maybe 40 minutes of loiter time left, enough for a few more gun runs before she'd have to break off and refuel. But 40 minutes could be enough. Had to be enough. Solid copy, Viper 26. I'm not leaving until you're clear. For the next 20 minutes, Nora turned the sky above that Special Forces team into a no-go zone. Every time the enemy tried to advance, she was there, dropping ordnance or making gun runs that forced them back into cover. She worked in a rhythm, high to low, weapon selection based on target density, each pass calculated to maximize effect while minimizing risk to the friendlies below. Her training, her experience, everything she'd learned over 18 years in the cockpit compressed into split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death for the men on the ground. Then Hammer Flight arrived, their F-16 streaking overhead at 20,000 feet, and suddenly Nora wasn't alone anymore. Reeves' voice came through on the tactical frequency, clipped and professional. Anvil 39er, Hammer 1, we're on station, what do you need? Nora felt a surge of relief. Pride could wait. Right now, she needed every available aircraft to keep these men alive. Hammer 1, Anvil 39er, I've got enemy forces regrouping in the Wadi system southeast of the friendly position. I'm Winchester on Mavericks and low on cannon rounds. Can you take them with precision? Copy, we're on it. Stay clear of the southern sector. The F-16s made their runs, JDAMs falling like the judgment of God, the explosions lighting up the desert floor in brilliant white flashes. The enemy fire slackened, then stopped. The Special Forces team made it to their rally point where 2 MH-60 Black Hawks were inbound for extraction. Nora circled overhead, her targeting pod scanning for threats, her finger resting lightly on the trigger of her nearly empty cannon, ready to empty the last of her ammunition if anything moved wrong. The helicopters touched down, rotors beating the dust into a brown cloud that obscured everything. Nora watched through infrared as the team loaded their wounded man first, then piled in after him, efficient and fast. The Black Hawks lifted off, banked hard, and accelerated south toward safety. Only then did Nora allow herself to breathe. Viper 26, Anvil 39er, you're clear of the objective area. Stay safe. The team leader's response came through heavy with exhaustion and something deeper. Anvil 39er, Viper 26. You held the line when we had nothing left. My team owes you everything. Thank you. The words hung in the air as Nora turned for home, her A-10 limping back toward Bagram with fuel gauges creeping toward zero and ammunition counters reading empty. She landed on fumes, the engines barely coughing as she taxied to the hardstand, every system red or yellow on her caution panel. When she shut down and climbed out, she found Voss waiting beside a fuel truck along with half the squadron. They didn't applaud or cheer. Military culture didn't work that way, but they were there and that said everything that needed saying. Reeves stood at the back of the group, his face unreadable. When Nora's boots hit the tarmac, he walked forward slowly, stopping a few feet in front of her. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then he extended his hand. That was good flying, Captain. Nora took his hand, feeling the tension in his grip, the grudging acknowledgement that cost him something to give. Thank you, sir. He nodded once, released her hand, and walked away. It wasn't forgiveness, wasn't friendship, but it was respect, earned the only way respect ever really was earned, by doing the job when it mattered most. Voss stepped up, grinning. You know they're going to write about you in the tactics manuals, right? Anvil's Run. The textbook example of how to execute danger close air support in a denied environment. Nora shook her head. They should write about the guys on the ground who held their position for 20 minutes with almost no ammunition. I just showed up. Yeah, Voss said quietly. You just showed up. Every single time. That's the point. The Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony took place 3 months later, back at Bagram in front of the entire wing. Nora stood at attention in her dress uniform while Colonel Hartwell read the citation, his voice carrying across the assembled formation. For heroism and extraordinary achievement while participating in aerial flight as an A-10 pilot in support of combat operations against enemy forces. Captain Cale distinguished herself by heroism while flying a close air support mission in support of friendly forces under hostile fire. Captain Cale's superior airmanship and devotion to duty in the face of grave danger directly contributed to the successful extraction of isolated ground forces and reflected great credit upon herself and the United States Air Force. He pinned the medal to her chest, the blue ribbon with its white stars stark against the dark uniform fabric. Then he stepped back and saluted. Nora returned the salute, feeling the weight of the medal and everything it represented. The applause that followed was genuine, rolling through the formation like thunder. She saw Captain Sullivan standing in the front row, his arm in a sling from a wound he'd taken in a different firefight, his face split in a wide smile. She saw the crew chiefs who'd kept her A-10 flying through mission after mission. She saw Voss and the other pilots from Hammer Flight, even Reeves, all of them acknowledging in this public moment what many of them had fought privately, that she belonged, that her call sign meant something, that the woman who'd been dismissed as damaged goods and a diversity hire had proven herself in the only arena that mattered, in the sky, under fire when lives hung in the balance. After the ceremony, Miguel Herrera found her. She didn't recognize him at first. 4 years had added weight and scars and a staff sergeant's chevrons to his uniform, but his eyes were the same, and when he smiled she remembered the young Marine who'd stood beside that shot up A-10 in 2019. "Captain Cale," he said, "I heard what you've been doing out here. Thought I'd come see if the rumors were true." Nora felt her composure crack. "Miguel, you're here. Got transferred to Bagram 2 months ago. Been hoping I'd get a chance to thank you in person for what you did back in Kandahar, and for what you've been doing every day since." He gestured to a group of Marines standing nearby, all of them watching with expressions of curiosity and respect. "These are my guys. I've told them the story about 100 times, about the pilot who wouldn't leave, the one they called Anvil because nothing could break her." Nora shook her head, overwhelmed. "I just did my job." "No, ma'am. With respect, you did more than that. You reminded all of us what it means to have someone who won't quit, who won't leave you behind, who shows up when you call no matter what." One of the other Marines stepped forward, a corporal with a Tennessee accent and a prosthetic leg visible below his shorts. "Captain, I was on that hillside in the Arghandab, the one where you made those gun runs at 100 meters. I took shrapnel in the firefight before you got there. Lost the leg, but I'm still here because you kept those Taliban fighters pinned down long enough for the medevac to land." He extended his hand and Nora shook it, feeling the strength in his grip. "Thank you doesn't really cover it, but it's all I've got." Nora found her voice, though it was rough. "Seeing you alive and whole and still in the fight, that's all the thanks I need." The group of Marines stayed for another 20 minutes, sharing stories, asking questions about the A-10, treating her not like a superior officer but like one of their own. When they finally left, Miguel lingered for a moment. "You know," he said quietly, "I kept your letter, the one you sent after you got medically discharged. You said you were sorry you couldn't fly anymore, that you hoped someone else would watch our backs the way you tried to." Nora remembered writing that letter. Remembered the despair that had driven every word, the certainty that her flying days were over and all she'd have left were memories of what she'd been. "Guess I was wrong about that," she said. Miguel smiled. "Yeah, ma'am, you were, and I'm really glad you were." The sun was setting over the Hindu Kush when Nora finally made it back to Tail 739er. She stood beside the aircraft, running her hand over the nose art, the cartoon figure with the hammer, the call sign that had defined her for so long. Tomorrow, there would be another mission, another call for support, another chance to prove that the old, slow, unglamorous warthog was exactly what you needed when everything else failed. But tonight, she just stood there in the cooling air, watching the shadows lengthen across the flight line, thinking about the path that had brought her here. She thought about the medical board that had tried to ground her, about the training command that had reluctantly recertified her, about Reeves and his contempt and his eventual grudging acknowledgement. She thought about the Marines who'd written statements on her behalf, about Captain Sullivan's unwavering advocacy, about Voss and the other pilots who'd started to see her not as a quota or a liability, but as someone who understood what the mission really meant. And she thought about the moment in that briefing room at Bagram when Reeves had asked her who put her here, his voice full of derision and doubt, as if her presence was an insult to everything the squadron stood for. The answer had been simple then. Command put her here. Politics, necessity, luck. But standing beside her aircraft now with the distinguished flying cross pinned to her uniform and the memory of Miguel Herrera's gratitude still fresh, Nora realized the answer had changed. Nobody put her here. She'd earned her way here. Step by step, flight by flight, gun run by gun run, through every moment when she'd had the choice to quit and had chosen instead to stay. The sky had put her here. The mission had put her here. The people who needed someone to show up when things got bad had put her here, and she was exactly where she belonged. Anvil, still unbreakable, still in the fight, still bringing people home.